Hello, my name is Linda Bartlett. This is Tony Bartlett. We welcome you to Sharing Stories with Linda and Tony. It's what we're calling this series of podcasts and videos that give an overview of our Seven Stories Bible study class. We're hoping that these will inspire you, get you excited about delving deeper into the material. The format is a series of questions and answers. I'll pose questions to Tony, who will hopefully give great answers, and we'll go from there. So, first of all, Tony, what is Seven Stories?
Well, seven stories is our basic Bethany teaching. It covers the whole of the Bible from the Old Testament through to the New Testament, especially the Gospels. And it does so via eight cycles of teaching, each containing three lessons. The first cycle is an introduction, and it tells us how we approach the material, the tools by which we approach the material. And then the following seven cycles are the actual meat of the guide, the teaching that we offer. And it takes us from one perspective to another. And that is the core of our approach, that the Bible is a developing story written over 1,000 years, which necessarily implies a movement forward. And so each of the stories, the seven stories, tells us how we progress from one perspective to the other. The first two take material from the Old Testament and showing that already in the Old Testament there is movement, there's progression, very much so. There is a conversation and a progressive change of perspective in the Old Testament, and then the third lesson in the cycle is from the Gospels, from Jesus, showing how Jesus took the material that we have developed in the first two lessons, used it and developed it himself, perfected it really with his own engagement and teaching using the pathway that he had taken from the Old Testament, as we've shown it in those lessons. So we end up with eight cycles, each consisting of three lessons each, and in that way we cover the whole of the Bible, showing how ultimately the Bible teaches us about a God of nonviolence.
Fantastic, great. So, the first of the cycles, as you mentioned, is an introductory cycle. So, it has three lessons in it. And the first lesson is called Critical Tools. So, before we even get into how we interpret the Bible, perhaps you can tell us, what is the Bible? This seems like a stupid question, but it's maybe more to it than we think.
Well, the first lesson of the first cycle, the introduction, is essential because it makes us aware, if we didn't know before or weren't fully aware, that the Bible only closed as a set document after the time of Jesus, and really only in the third or fourth century of our era. There was an open canon before that, and only closed in that period. And then in the Reformation, under Martin Luther, the some of that, what the content of the Old Testament was questioned by him, and so a number of books were excluded, as he saw that they weren't, in his view, essential to Revelation. And so, with that background, and knowing also that the three major divisions of Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, Roman Catholicism, and Protestantism, they basically have variations of what's in the Bible. So, along with the change over time and the development of the canon, and then the questioning of the canon in the Protestant era, there's also variations in those three major divisions. So there's no such thing as one kind of perfect set document that's always unchanged in every letter, every instance, every book even.
Because there was also the different translations and the different
Right.
interpretations.
Right. Yes, and especially beginning in the Reformation and the Renaissance, the translations of the Bible became progressively more scientifically based in a range of manuscripts, and it became a study in its own right. So progressively over that period, and especially in our modern period, there are numerous translations of the Bible, and every translation, by definition, implies a degree of interpretation. You know, when anybody interpreting one language to another makes some kind of interpretation. So we have numerous slight interpretations in the translations we've got. And then if you add in the doctrinal perspectives, especially between those divisions of Catholicism and Protestantism, you would have a theological perspective as well.
So the people who are making the different translations or interpretations of the Bible have their own theological slant that will play into whether they choose one word over another in the text.
Absolutely, and there are numerous examples of that. So there's, once again, you know, if you pick up the Bible, you're not picking up something that fell like a tablet from heaven. You're picking up a human document that, in its growth and then its interpretation and translation, has evolved over the centuries. So what the first lesson tells us, that we're dealing with a living text that is always in need of being read together and understood and interpreted by a community.
And actually, there are thousands of different versions of the Bible out there. No two Bibles are exactly identical.
Well, I mean, you have the versions that are identical in their print form, but I mean, yes, there are many. I wouldn't say thousands, but there are many variant translations, and some are more literal, and some are more up to date in their language. Some would be more interpretive in terms of using more poetic language. And again, in those translations, there'll be interpretation at play. And in some instances, that interpretation is really crucial.
So what is the Seven Stories approach to interpreting the Bible?
Well, the Seven Stories seeks to show that from the beginning of the biblical text, beginning in Genesis, there is an underlying growth in perspective. It's implied right from the very beginning, which is taking you from an understanding of God conditioned by human violence to an understanding of God where God is not violent. In fact, God is the diametric opposite of violent. Is forgiveness, compassion, peace, non-violence. And for us to change that understanding is a work of centuries, and it's a work of community reading the Bible together so that we reflect in our souls on that meaning.
And so the Seven Stories, we use certain tools that or approaches that help with that, to see that movement. One of them is that we read the text within the historical context, and we also look at the language to see whether the language is, narrative, poetic, allegorical. What is try to get ourselves into the mind of the person who's writing the text, and all that helps us to see what was the context in which the writings were written. And as you say, initially the God of the earlier texts would have be seen maybe as more of a warrior, a violent, more of a violent God, or a God that has the ability to act violently. But as the story progresses and the people suffer, you'll have a very different God emerging at that point as history progresses. So that's what you're talking about in terms of
So what
atonement.
Linda is describing there is kind of two aspects to understanding the Bible. One is a critical method, whereby you understand, obviously, that this text has emerged over time, and that the situation, time and place, and the conditions of the writer or the community that's producing a document shape a lot the intended meaning of that document, and they shape the story of the text that comes afterwards. And some of it is quite sophisticated. Once you get into it, you understand the writers are by no means pedestrian. They're really sophisticated writers, actually bringing us in, always seeking to improve our perspective on our relationship with God. So the critical perspective, the critical method, which is historical and literary, as Linda mentioned there, is one part. The other part is the understanding of the Bible as dealing with the core issue of human violence.
Okay, we'll get to that in 1 minute, but just before we leave this, just wanted to ask you, in what way does the Seven Stories approach differ from the fundamentalist Christian reading of the Bible, where they see that every word is literally true in each and every expression? So how does the Seven Stories approach contrast with
Well, the
that?
Seven Stories approach is very different, and in fact, again, it's almost the opposite, because it says you have a developing text here, and you have a developing story. And so in one part is not of the same value as the other. Not everything, it's not a flat text. And that would make sense for something that's written basically over 1,000 years. Why have a document that's written over a period of 1,000 years, unless the various authors in that library of documents are continually dealing with a core issue or a core set of issues which they're trying to develop their understanding of. So
that's good. So you see that the Bible itself, as this living document
yes,
that's growing, can actually end up critiquing earlier
versions of itself,
earlier versions of itself.
Yeah.
A very rich
and dynamic understanding.
Yes.
And the reason, I mean, we're putting this out here right at the very beginning. It's plain for everyone that a fundamentalist or literalist reading of the scripture implies the power of the authority of the text itself. Of course, that authority has to be wielded by a preacher or teacher, and so there's always going to be some human element in it. But if you make every part of the text equal and of equal weight, then it has that kind of like monolithic quality to it, which is very, very powerful. We are saying something very different. This is a growing discussion about our relationship with God, and it hinges on the issue of violence. So it's not to do with authority and the weight of a text, but it's to do with a journey, a pathway, which we're being invited into, so that we may learn actually a different perspective, a very different perspective, but a new way of being human.
Great. So you did earlier mention, the core issue for us as Christians is the problem of atonement, which is the second lesson in the introductory cycle. Before we get to what the problem of atonement is, can you tell us what atonement itself is? What does that mean?
So underlying our approach is, and kind of in parallel with it, is this issue of the atonement, because that has affected very powerfully traditional readings of the Old Testament and New Testament. Now, atonement, if you break it down, it's very simple in its meaning. It means at one-ment. It's a contraction of at one-ment. And it comes from a translation of the word reconciliation. And that was its original meaning in the beginning of the 16th century. But progressively, as we know, atonement doesn't mean reconciliation. It means compensation or payment. And so I atone for my faults by doing something that is difficult and puts me at pains, and I pay for, in some way for what I've done wrong. So from the meaning of putting together what was divided, it actually takes on a meaning of payment and compensation of one party to an offended party.
So in the Bible, obviously in the Gospels and the way Christians use the word atonement, they're talking specifically about what the death and resurrection of Jesus means. What did it do for humanity?
Exactly right.
And how does that at-one-ment or that atonement come about?
Right.
So tell me a little bit more about what the most common understanding of atonement is
Right.
for Christians today generally.
The change in the meaning of the term goes along with the interpretation, as we're stressing here, that is made of the core biblical event for Christians, which is the death and resurrection of Jesus. So, what does that mean? And atonement is the answer, is the kind of shorthand name for what that means. And in the past, really beginning in the Middle Ages, kind of the beginning of the High Middle Ages, and then actually redoubling in the Reformation, it becomes a compensation to God. So Jesus' death is a compensation to God for the effect of sin in diminishing God's honor and his justice in the world, offending it and damaging it. And that can't be left unatoned. It can't be left uncompensated. So Jesus' death is an act of putting right by suffering and by death this kind of major fault in the universe.
And in the Reformation, it was understood as penal substitution,
right.
And that phrase sort of tells it all, that somebody or Jesus substitutes himself to bear the punishment,
right,
or the wrath of God.
So punishment is due, and the punishment is death. Really, that's the punishment for sin. Somebody has to take that punishment, and Jesus does. So it's a very kind of simple, kind of mechanical formula that has ruled both the Catholic and then the Protestant world in an even more blatant form. As the phrase Linda uses, penal atonement. Penal substitution, as it rules the thinking about what the meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection is.
And that leads to a very wrathful, angry, scary, dangerous God that we're dealing with.
I mean, if God cannot love us unless this enormous price is paid, and it's the suffering and death of his own son, then that casts a major shadow over the character and identity of the biblical God. And we are actually continually suffering from the consequences of that shadow.
So that is the problem.
That is the problem.
Atonement.
That is the problem of atonement.
So the Seven Stories approach offers a very different understanding of the purpose or the results that lead from the death and resurrection.
It offers a very different understanding of what the meaning of the death and resurrection of Jesus is. Not to pay a price, but to show forth the truth. And the truth that it shows forth is very evidently the violence that human beings are capable of inflicting. And yet God, in his son Jesus, forgives his persecutors, and offers thereby a vision of God without violence, without retaliation, without wrath, and without danger.
So this is it's not a transaction that is required by a wrathful God, that somebody has to pay the price. Rather, it is a non-violent, loving God sending his son into the world to show us a different way of being human, one that is non-violent.
Yeah.
And
if you think about it, that is the most enormous change
yes.
that human beings could undergo. I mean,
Yeah.
the other teaching of satisfaction for God's offended honor or penal substitution doesn't require us to change. It says any change that's going to take place is going to be after life when we'll be fully spiritualized. But basically, our modus agendi, the way we operate in the world, remains entirely the same because we say God is just the supreme example of our vindictive, violent character.
In that old way of understanding atonement, we're projecting our own human violence onto God, whereas the more this fresh approach to understanding the meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection is grounded in non-violence and life.
Yeah.
And there's no violence.
And really grounded in the evident character of Jesus. I mean,
yes. So the third part of the introductory cycle, we focus on the anthropology and the teaching of a thinker called René Girard who emerged in the second half of the second century,
the 20th century.
Sorry, the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And he gave us some tools, some structure to understand the origins of human violence. And in understanding it, we can begin to see how God connects to that and in Jesus overturns the systems or breaks those cycles of violence. So perhaps, do you want to tell us a little bit more first of all, about René Girard's teaching, and then later we can talk about how that applies to this study of the Bible and understanding the teaching and the mission of Jesus. So first of all, tell us a bit more about René Girard's 3 key teachings.
Yes, so René Girard has offered a quite extraordinary system of understanding and approach to human life that is really what is called a meta anthropology. It's not field anthropology; it's an anthropology that covers the whole story of humanity, and through various approaches. I'm not going to go into them, but he, using texts, essentially key texts of both the Bible and also of Western literature, he identified, first of all, the character of humans as what he calls mimetic. And mimesis is the Greek word for imitation, but he doesn't use the word imitation because imitation so often implies something conscious or childish. But he says the mimesis is the core of our human being, and it goes back to the first evolutionary emergence of the human species. So the original, what is called hominid or kind of proto-human, their capacity for imitation in their brain has grown exponentially. They become smart, but the key part of that imitation or mimesis is the imitation of somebody else's desires. So it's not just to imitate behaviors as such. We imitate what we interpret the other person wants. And that imitation shows us what we want. We know what we desire because of what the other desires.
So the crowd really tells us what is desirable. It's not something that's innate inside of us.
No.
We're taught what is desirable. And of course, advertising is the key example of that. We're taught what is desirable through advertisements and through media. And
if you see 2 children together, I mean, just going off track a little bit here, but you see 2 children, 2 brothers, 2 siblings, they are they're observing each other. Their eyes are locked on each other all the time as to what this other one's getting, what this other one's doing, what they're playing at, what they want. And then child number two wants exactly what child number one wants. And even if the parent offers child number two something that could be kind of objectively better, a nicer cookie or whatever, no, they want what child number one is getting. That is because children are the most evident and naked uh, um, illustration of mimetic desire. But Girard says that all humans do it, and they do it very powerfully.
That's right. So, and then obviously, if you have you're both desiring the same object in that example of the two children, it can very quickly result in conflict.
No doubt. And you'll see it in children,
yeah.
That they'll hit each other, steal the toy, whatever it is, and then there'll be tears.
So then you get this situation where there's a spiraling violence, especially within a group, and it can become very dangerous very quickly. And so then that leads to the second of Girard's.
So Girard, having identified mimetic desire as a key aspect of human relations, it's a kind of what he calls interindividual psychology. It's something we do together between each other. It's not just something located inside an individual psyche. It's something we're common animals in that sense. But once he understood and identified that anthropology of being human, and he saw the potential for violence that resulted from it. He then identified sacrifice and the scapegoat as the key method by which humans then deal with this explosive, this potentially terminal violence that can break out in groups. And that means that at some point in the conflict of a group, one individual can be set apart as the truly guilty one, as the one who's caused all the problem in the first place. And this person is different can be different in a number of different ways. They can actually be smarter than everybody else. They can be more beautiful than everybody else, or they can be uglier than everybody else. They can be a different color from it. They can be albino, for example. There's something about this, or they could be blind. There's something about them that sets them apart. And then the group violence discharges. This is a major component of his theory. This group violence discharges on this one individual, and then suddenly there's peace. There's a transformative peace, which he says is the birth of the sacred. The moment of when everything else is this turmoil and this immense stress in the primitive group is replaced by this kind of transcendent magical peace that comes after the killing of the scapegoat.
So, and then that transitions, obviously, over time, as culture develops, that scapegoating mechanism translates into sacrificial systems.
Very quickly, humans learn that killing of an individual in the group or killing of a substitute for an individual, i.e. an animal, can have something of the same effect as that group scapegoating, group victiming of an individual. And this explains the enormously widespread practice of sacrifice in human culture.
And it had not been really fully explained.
No one really understood sacrifice before.
Just emerged.
It was just a factum of human behavior. That was a kind of a given. But the fact that it is so widespread to be universal, and that the divine, the relationship with the God, is always negotiated and managed via sacrifice. It tells you that the God, the sacred, has a lot to do with this group victim. So that's the second stage of Girard's understanding.
And so tell us a little bit more about the third final stage of Girard's thought that we use.
So that's very important, and that's the entry point for us as people who read the Bible and love the Bible as a resource of a relationship with God, of the meaning of God in our lives. Gerard identified the Bible, and this is the third major element in his understanding. He identified the Bible as a cultural document, but that was unique in terms of revealing the victim and standing by the victim. So you have figures like uh, Abel, killed by Cain, and then you have Joseph and his brothers. His brothers try to kill him, and then they sell him into slavery. But in both these cases, and then someone like Job, for example, as well, who's seen by his friends, the counselors, as somehow necessarily guilty, but he protests his innocence. But the Bible continually takes the side of what should be the group victim and allows that victim to stand forward in their own right and progressively to become a feature of human understanding, that we understand that that's what we do. We make victims of individuals. And then, of course, Jesus, yes, Jesus becomes the supreme example of that, when everybody at the end of his life turns against him and they submit him to the most horrendous death, which is supposed both to discharge the violence of the crowd and the empire and the temple upon him, to reinforce the power structure, and to end his story. That's the end of the story of the victim. But of course, in the New Testament, Jesus rises again, which kind of breaks the myth of the victim terminally. So from then on in, right, and going back, as I've described in the Old Testament, and then forward through Jesus, from there onwards, it's no longer possible to be completely secure and happy with the killing of a scapegoat or the blaming of a scapegoat, the killing of a victim. So the world is destabilized in one key area of its functioning, which is both wonderful because it sets the victim free in a sense and promises them life. On the other hand, the systems of the world, the violent systems of the world, do not work anymore like they used to, even though they seem to work because we have so much violence. It seems to, but really, that's just redoubling the violence in order to try to get the system to work. That's Girard's point of view, and that kind of analysis, those three elements: mimetic desire, scapegoating, and the biblical revelation, stand behind our understanding of the biblical text and its growing evolution as a revelation of both the victim and of God not being violent, not joining in, not being able to be understood or interpreted in what Linda says is the projection of our violence upon God.
Because Jesus on the cross is that ultimate scapegoat, but he does not retaliate. No, he forgives the enemy, and in doing so, he breaks that cycle of violence.
Yes.
And also he reveals God,
yeah,
as nonviolent.
In one and the same moment, he breaks the cycle and he reveals God. They both go hand in hand.
So how do those three insights of René Girard, in a nutshell, how do they impact the meaning of Christ's death and resurrection?
Well, I mean, I've kind of already said it, but so rather than paying very, very different, completely different from penal substitution and paying a penalty to God for his offended honor and power.
It's the exact opposite.
It is not something that's going towards God to make it right with God, but it's coming from God into our world to change the character of human relations, change the nature of our world, which of course is the meaning of grace. It's a free act by God for our benefit. But if grace has to be earned by this previous compensation by atonement, it's not really grace. It's part of the financing of salvation
transaction.
is transaction by atonement.
Whereas this, you're saying then that the meaning of the cross and the resurrection of Jesus is revelatory. It's revelation.
It's revelatory and it's transformative.
It opens up understanding, and it brings light into how we are, how we act as human beings. And it also shows us the way to act and be differently as human beings in the world. And in so doing, then we bring about the kingdom of God on
earth, as Jesus proclaimed, the kingdom of God is very near.
Thank you.
So that is the content of 7 stories. I mean, that's the initial. That's the method we use, the approach we use, and in a way, the whole package. But 7 stories actually goes through, more or less blow by blow, the narrative sequence of the Bible from beginning to end, in order to show that this is what is at work all the time. Yeah. So the earlier books, the earlier texts, have a very limited understanding, which you would say is the book of Exodus and the book of the initial Deuteronomy, and the original stories still see a lot of human violence projected onto God. But as the Israelite story progresses, then this non-violent understanding of God grows and grows until you get to the person of Jesus, and we get the full revelation of the non-violent God. And so in each of those lessons, each of the cycles, just show that movement, that movement through the text from one place to the other, from oppression dominating to oppression to transformation of some sort, to justice and liberation, from violence to forgiveness, from wrath in God to a compassionate God. These are the movements that we explain and teach in the 7 Stories class. Right. So thank you for joining us for the initial podcast. And I hope that this will inspire you to follow the whole course, to get the book and to read those chapters, because there's always stuff that you can pick up that won't be in the broadcast. And anyway, we invite you to connect with us. You can check us out on at our webpage, which is bethanyscenter.community. Yeah. Also, if you want to take part in the 7 Stories class, contact us through that website, and we'll connect you to a class online or in person. And finally, check out the next podcast in the series coming soon. Thank you.